The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
I think that the public will judge you more harshly for not using a tool that you could have to make their lives better.
Then, later on The Agenda.
They didn't just compete politically, they came to dislike each other strongly. Pearson despised Diefenbaker, and Marion despised Diefenbaker as well.
Once upon a time, every mayor in this province got elected by winning the majority of votes across their municipality. But when it came time to vote at council, they had just one vote like every other councillor. Not so anymore. A little over a year and a half ago, the Ontario government gave the mayors of Toronto and Ottawa so-called strong mayor powers. It meant that under certain circumstances, these mayors could override council votes that they'd actually lost. Today, 46 mayors in total have those extra powers. How's it all working out? Well, we've gathered 3 of the 46 here to find out, and here they are in order of population size of their cities. Andrea Horwath is the mayor of Hamilton, and she joins us from the Steel City. And here in our studio, Marianne Mead-Ward, the mayor of Burlington, and Cam Guthrie, the mayor of Guelph. And it's great to have you two here in our studio, and your worship in the, well, I'm just going to say it, in my hometown. It's lovely to see you again, and thanks for coming on tonight. I want to start with this. I want to get a sense from all 3 of you off the top of what your view was on these strong mayor powers when Premier Ford gave them to you in the first place. Mayor Horwath, was it your inclination when you first got the powers to use them or not?
Oh, definitely not. In fact, I was pretty clear with my council colleagues that my way of doing things is trying to hammer out a consensus, or at the very least make sure that everybody's comfortable with decisions that we make as a group. Some people will not be on side, some people will, but didn't really expect to utilize the strong mayor powers. Mayor
Mead-Ward, what about you?
Well, I said at the time that we didn't need strong mayor powers, didn't ask for them. We do need strong cities, which is a whole other show. But, you know, there's a whole bunch of different powers in there. And I think the one that got people's most concerned about was the ability to present a bylaw and get it passed with 1/3 support. So that's where all the focus of the conversation went. But there's also powers like my ability to appoint a vice chair of a committee. Does democracy crumble to the ground because I can appoint a vice chair? No, but this gets lumped in with this other one, which is overriding a vote with 1/3 support. So that is problematic. I understand the concerns around that. I've not had to use the powers for anything other than approving what council has decided. So that's been our experience in Burlington.
We shall talk about all this and more. Mayor Guthrie, how about you? Your inclination at the beginning?
Yeah, I along with my colleagues here and probably many others, felt at the time that it was not really worth it. It was potentially going to cause some issues internally with relationships, and it was better, as Andrea rightly said, the collaborative approach at that time. And it was also a divide, I think, between both the political and the administration, where that was not quite clear anymore with the strong mayor powers. So there was some concerns around there at that time as well.
What I find interesting about all of your answers is that since then, you have all used these strong mayor powers, even though you were inclined not to use them off the top. And Mayor Guthrie, I'll follow up with you. You said when Premier Ford gave you the strong mayor powers, to me, this legislation starts to diminish the role of a councillor. A councillor can give opinions, ideas, and feedback. No one mayor knows everything about every issue. So what made you change your mind?
I think a few things. The first is that a lot of this has to do, for me, with housing. And secondary would be affordability, of course. And when the legislation was tabled, there was no requirement of municipalities to have housing targets. The housing crisis got a lot worse since that time. And so in the ability for me to leverage the strong mayor powers to try to propel those issues forward around housing and affordability, I think was wise at this time to do that, because it was the crisis that we were in on those two issues. I felt like it was needed for me to do that. As a previous councillor, before I became the mayor, I could understand why I said what I said there. And I actually still quite believe it. But I think up to the mayor to work collaboratively, even with the powers to be used, with fellow colleagues on council and the administration, is still something that I want to continue to do.
All right, let's stay with housing here. And Mayor Horwath, I'll go back to you because you used your strong mayor powers just a week ago to push through a nonprofit organization's plan to build affordable housing in Stoney Creek, which is, of course, in the east end of Hamilton. The plan that you presented, I guess, failed twice on tie votes. It was 8-8 both times, but you pushed it through using your strong mayor powers. And I guess the question is, do you think that was appropriate to do?
I first want to say, in fact, it was the City of Hamilton's decision to use surplus city lands for affordable housing. That was a unanimous decision that was made back in the summer, alongside of a kind of a mechanism for that happening, which is our housing secretariat. And so we knew the housing crisis was huge in Hamilton. In fact, I think you wrote about it in your blog not too long ago, Steve. And so it is absolutely and continues to be the biggest crisis we are facing. And so the council had unanimously agreed upon that it was an emergency, agreed that we needed to sell off surplus land. We have a whole roadmap, our housing sustainability and investment roadmap that was unanimously supported by council. We had the secretariat, the housing secretariat. This is the mechanism by which the roadmap is implemented, unanimously supported by council. And so this was the first report back, identifying one of their jobs was to identify surplus city lands that could be used for affordable housing. And yes, the committee didn't support it on a tie vote. And then when it got to council, the same tie vote remained. And so I felt that it was important to stay true to the values that the council had identified, to the commitments that we had made, to the infrastructure we put in place to make those commitments a reality, and that's why I made the decision to bring forward the 1/3 vote that Mayor Mead Ward was talking about.
A couple of quick follow-ups here, because it does raise the question of whether or not half of council now feels it can't work with you anymore because you did use your strong mayor powers. And here's Matt Francis saying, circumventing the democratic process and a stomp on the will of an entire community. It's a dangerous precedent. I fear for what's next. Is he right in as much as he says this is a dangerous precedent?
Absolutely not. Look, it was not an easy decision to make, and I took some time in having that thoughtfulness around it and speaking to a number of people. What's true is that I did speak to a number of people in Stoney Creek, the BIAs, the business leaders, community leaders, to get their perspective. They raised a couple of important issues, particularly around one of the parcels is labeled Veterans Way. So how do we honor those veterans if we're turning a parking lot into housing? Similarly, BIA was worried about parking spaces because there are going to be some parking spaces that are lost when these two parcels become affordable housing. So what did I do? I issued a mayor's directive under the strong mayor's power to staff to do the necessary consultation and research, both with BIA and with community in terms of parking, as well as with the veterans and community around making sure that we continue to honor veterans, along with the eventual provider that will be chosen through a very open and a transparent process. Again, the Housing Secretariat will do that job.
Okay, Mayor Mead Ward, I'm not asking you to comment on what's going on in Hamilton. That's not your affair to worry about. But the notion that somehow these decisions become a dangerous precedent going forward, can you speak to that?
There's transparency and accountability built right into the legislation. So every decision that you make has to be posted publicly online. That's how we know about them. And the public will judge you. And I believe that the public will look at the ability of a mayor to have a tool and use a tool to make their life better, whether it is affordable housing, whether it is on the budget. These are two areas where mayors are required on the budget to use the powers. So I think that the public will judge you more harshly for not using a tool that you could have to make their lives better than using it. And then they can see how you've used it, and they can make their decision at the next election. But even in advance of that, the community will talk about whether this is a good thing or not a good thing. And that conversation is happening in Hamilton, it's happening in Guelph, in London, in many places where these tools have been used by the mayors to advance what they thought were council priorities, identified priorities, or community priorities. And so I think that is actually part of the democratic process, is making decisions on behalf of your constituents. We do it all the time. And the public will tell you what they think of that.
Mayor Horwath, I want to go back to you with one more quote, because this is great Hamilton language here, as you and I both know. The new housing would be built, as you pointed out, on what is now a parking lot, which prompted another Hamilton City Councillor named Councillor John Paul Danko to say, I'm trying to think if I've ever heard a discussion with more melodramatic horse shit. We're talking about a delta of a couple of dozen parking spots. Let's move on. Does he sort of sum up your views on this?
Well, I'd never use that kind of Hamilton language, Steve.
Of course
you know
not.
me better than that.
Yes.
No, so there's some frustration around the table. There's no doubt, and that's why I moved forward, because we knew that although some people don't feel comfortable making these tough decisions have to be made when you're in a crisis. So we can talk about the crisis, we can lament about it, we can put in plans about how to address it, we can put in systems to make those plans work. But then when the rubber hits the road, you have to make the tough decisions. And I think that's what this councillor was feeling frustrated about. Let's actually get to making the decisions that'll make a difference.
How many times have you used your strong mayor powers so far?
I think about 21, and all posted online, that's why I know. And fully, I'm going to say 13 or 14 of those were simply to implement the bylaws that council had approved. So it's a little known fact that you have to use your powers to not veto the decisions that you made as a council. And so that is a mayor's decision. You have to use the powers to tell staff to prepare a budget. There's no discretion in that. I can't just sit back. I have to prepare a budget, and I have to direct staff to do that. So in Burlington, that's the nature of the decisions that have been made. In other municipalities that we're talking about here, they've used it for different things, and based on their view of what the community needs.
How many times have you used yours?
Outside of the administration side of things, I have used it 3 times. The first one was our community was looking at a 10% budget increase for 2025, and I felt that was completely unaffordable. And I listened to the community very well before I made the decision that I directed staff to bring back a budget this fall that is under 4%. And then we can have a conversation as a community after that. The other 2 have to do with housing. One was around homelessness, and to see what it would take for us to partner with others to look at a temporary structured encampment site, a tiny home community for those that are experiencing homelessness. And so that information is going to be coming forward to council. And the last one was around leveraging community assets, city-owned land, parking lots that we can leverage into building homes for people that need them right now. And again, that will come back to council as well. So this issue of democracy is, an interesting one that people will table and throw out there as I believe, a talking point. But these issues actually do come back, the ones that I've used anyways, to the council table. The community is involved. Council is completely involved, and we can have a full discussion. What I'm doing is trying to speed up the process on getting these issues to the table so we can get action on them.
I get you, but I mean, it's more than a talking point for some people. All of the living ex-mayors of Toronto, so we're talking David Crombie, David Miller, Barbara Hall, Art Eggleton, John Sewell, they all wrote a letter, it was actually to the former mayor, John Tory, saying that using these strong mayor powers to override the majority view on council is inconsistent with democracy. Let me get some conversation about that going. Are they right about that, Mayor Mead Ward?
Well, that goes back to a misunderstanding of the whole bundle of powers. There's a whole bunch of different things.
No, I get that. Not budget making, not committee selections, just the overriding a vote you've lost.
Right, and so I have veto power. We all have veto power now, specifically around budgets. So, but the council can override me. with a 2/3 vote. So there is a built-in protection, and that's not uncommon in a democracy either, where, for example, if we want to reconsider one of our own votes, we think we made a mistake and we want to reconsider it, happens from time to time, that also requires a 2/3 vote threshold. So that is part of the process of democracy, where if you feel a decision has been made that is not in the best interest of your community and you have the power to act, the community will expect you to act. And when you do, the council can override you. So there are checks and balances built into the system.
Mayor Horvath, how much flack have you received from using your strong mayor powers so far?
I would say I'm getting a mixed response, frankly. Some people have been very supportive, recognizing and thoughtful about the acknowledging that it was a tough decision to make, that I don't take that kind of a decision lightly. And so people here in Hamilton get that piece. But folks who are very concerned about the housing crisis, who are very concerned about making sure that we're moving forward. Interestingly enough, one of those 2 lots was declared surplus for affordable housing back in 2018, and nothing's happened on it since. And so it's interesting. I think many people have articulated a support for the decision because it impacts our most pressing crisis that we have in Hamilton. Others not so much because of the kinds of things that we've been talking about. For example, what the mayors were saying in their letter to Mayor Tory at the time. But at the end of the day, as Mayor Mead Ward said, there are things that as leaders we have to take on. We have to do our best to be strong as mayors to move our cities forward in a very, very difficult time. And in my case, it was an 8-8 tie. Many people have said you were basically the tiebreaker on this particular issue, and yes, there have been people that have been unhappy, but it's been quite a mixed response, frankly.
Yeah, you're quite right. It was 2 tie votes that you ended up using your strong mayor powers for. I know politicians are told never answer a hypothetical question, but that's not going to stop me from putting one to you anyway. And that is, what if it hadn't been a tie vote? What if you were on the losing end or maybe down 2 votes on that vote? Would you have still used those strong mayor powers?
I really don't know the answer to that, Steve, frankly, because as I said, it wasn't something that I had intended to use ever. In fact, one of my counselors sent me a little text encouraging me to do this, to consider it seriously. And I said, I never thought I would have to consider it. TBH, to be honest, in the text, and that's why each circumstance is going to be different, and it's not only the council members, it's also the community at large, and the challenges and opportunities, frankly, that the city's facing that need to be considered.
So, Mayor Guthrie, again, not the budget-making aspects, not the department-making aspects, or the appointment aspects that are also part of your strong mayor powers, but strictly on the issue of whether or not it's appropriate in a democracy for you to override a council decision on a vote that you've lost. Are you still comfortable doing that?
I think depending on the issue, yes, I would, because I ultimately, at the end of the day, I am going to be judged by the electorate and the citizens and businesses of my community. And in speaking with them on the matters that I have already used the strong mayor powers for, I have a lot of support for those reasons. And so I think it would have to be highly justified, and it has to be dependent upon the issue. I can tell you that when it comes to housing and affordability, those would be at the top of my list as to why I would want to try to help the community as best as I can with the way I have this legislative power to do so. And then I'll be judged accordingly.
Let's see if the rubber's really hitting the road then. You've used these strong mayor powers to get housing built more quickly. Will that, in fact, happen now?
We don't know yet, because these reports are going to be coming back to council, and so we'll see. If there has been times in the past where I reflect being mayor for 10 years now, where I certainly would have used my veto power. There was one case in Guelph and where there was about 700 homes that was approved and recommended by our professional staff, which council voted down. That then was tied up in an OLT hearing.
Ontario Land Tribunal.
Yes, that's right. And for well over a year, right in the height of the housing crisis that started the last few years. and the city lost completely. I was on the losing side of that vote, and I knew that that would have been a waste of time and a waste of money, and I was right. So that particular case is something that I reflect on to say, if that kind of case presented itself again in today's situation with the housing crisis, even worse than it was several years ago when that decision was made, it would be the right decision to make today for sure.
I want to follow up with Mayor Mead Ward on that. Can you, I mean, there's no guarantees in life, but can you give a very strong undertaking that the use of strong mayor powers will in fact get more of the kind of affordable housing built, for example, in Burlington that you'd want to see?
I think that it might if it speeds up the process, because what we've heard is that time is money, and the delays in getting shovel in the ground makes everything more expensive. And we have seen projects be shelved in Burlington for other reasons, have nothing to do with whether I use powers or not, but they've been delayed. And now that interest rates are what they are, and the supply chain issues and inflation, we have projects that are on ice right now in the city of Burlington. And if those had gotten their approvals sooner, but it didn't require a mayor's directive. There are other reasons why things are delayed, but time is money, and that's what we've heard. And certainty is money. And sometimes developers will not move forward if they don't think that the end is going to deliver in a timely manner. And if you're going to the Ontario Land Tribunal, that's a year or two before you can even think about getting your permits to get shovel in the ground. And so that, I think, was, I don't read the mind of the province. I wasn't there when they wrote the legislation, but I think they were trying to speed things along. And as Cam said, the decisions actually in most cases require something to come back to council for a discussion. Same with Mayor Horvath. So council still has a role and still has decision-making ability to weigh in on these things. And I think that's all part of the system.
Mayor Horvath, that's the question I want to put to you as well, because supply chain issues still exist, inflation still exists, interest rates are high for developers, that still exists. Some of them can't get access to the kind of workers they need to get this stuff built. So you've used your strong mayor powers. Can you basically give 100% commitment that project in Stoney Creek is now going to go forward?
Well, what I can say is it has a better chance than virtually any other project that's going to be done with city-owned land that is not already zoned. And so that was a big factor for us. The zoning is already in place for those 2 parking lots to become mixed-use lots. In other words, housing is already an available use for those 2 lots. And so that speeds up the process considerably because there's no rezoning required. But not dissimilarly, I think that it's important to acknowledge that there are other factors that are in play here. And in fact, following up on what Marianne had to say, it's absolutely the case, or maybe it was Cam, it's absolutely the case that the staff recommendation in our case was to utilize those surplus properties. And so I wasn't kind of off in la land, not listening to or paying attention to the recommendation of city staff. That was their recommendation. It made a lot of sense. It was properly reviewed and undertaken. And so that gave me extra, I guess, confidence, if you will, that was the right move to make. And so that's where we are. But can I guarantee? Absolutely not. We do, however, have a process in place to identify the not-for-profit provider that will be chosen. That process is right now underway. So we have the land, it's zoned, it is now available for the housing, and the proponent, if you will, very soon will be identified. So those are all very positive pieces that will lead to a quicker build than, let's say, a piece of housing or land rather that's surplus to the city but not zoned. And in fact, that report that I just talked about, that was the city recommendation, included 6 properties in 4 different wards. These were the only 2, in fact, that were already zoned for housing.
Gotcha. I have 30 seconds left to ask Mayor Mead Ward a real smart-ass question here. So here we go. You 3 are, of course, completely reasonable, intelligent mayors, and you would never inappropriately use these powers. But what if the good burghers in your city at some point in the future decide to elect a complete nut job as the mayor of the city, and this nut job wants to use these powers very inappropriately and on some very sketchy stuff? Will that make you think twice about the advisability of giving you folks these powers?
So people elect all kinds of people to office, and they will very quickly, at the appropriate time, unelect them if they don't see that they're serving the interests of the community. So democracy has a way of fixing any problem that there is. And in the meantime, mayors and their councils and their communities have a tool to advance priorities. There's built-in transparency. And if they don't like the decisions that are being made, first of all, they know about them because they're all posted online. And secondly, they can unelect anyone. And I've beaten incumbents, as you know. So all of us are beatable. And if the community is not happy with the decisions that we've made, they'll make their voice heard.
Smart-ass question, thoughtful answer. There we go. Mr. Director, can I get a three-shot, please, of the three their worships? Andrea Horvath, the mayor of Hamilton; Cam Guthrie, the mayor of Guelph; Mary Ann Mead Ward, the mayor of Burlington. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
We don't often in this country get significant new books on former prime ministers, let alone on two in the same book. But from 1957 to 1968, Canada got two of its most noteworthy prime ministers. And so our next segment begins in the foyer of the House of Commons. For decades, historians have been telling us that two of our better-known prime ministers, John Diefenbaker over here and Lester Pearson over here, not only hated each other, but were extraordinarily different in every way. Dief was a Tory. Pearson was a Liberal. Dief was filled with angry, prairie-based grievance. This guy won a Nobel Prize for diplomacy. Well, John Ibbitson's come along from the Globe and Mail and has written a book saying these two guys built on each other's work more than you might think. The book is called The Duel: Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada.
How long did it take you to write this? 4 years. Started it in 2019 and finished it, 6 months before it came out last fall.
Don't take this the wrong way, but why so long?
Well, I had a day job, for one thing.
There is that.
And it's a big topic. It's 160,000 words.
That is a big book. Look at this portrait, for starters. What kind of a guy does that look like to you?
It looks like a guy who never got over the fact that he was a small farmer, son of a small farmer who was a failure as a poor kid growing up, who couldn't believe all the honorary doctorates that he was given once he became prime minister.
So he wants
he wants his robes on when he has his portrait taken. It's so John Diefenbaker.
How much of the reason for your writing this book is the fact that you think John Diefenbaker basically got a raw deal from previous historians in this country's history?
Half of it, I would say. So I don't know about you, but I read Peter Newman's Renegade and Power when I was in high school. He was in the high school library. And I grew up, as everybody else did, with the assumption that Diefenbaker was a failed prime minister, that he had the biggest majority government in Canadian history, and that he squandered it. He was erratic, temperamental, indecisive. And then he was defeated by Lester Pearson, who gave us the flag and pensions and everything else. But I found over the decades as a journalist, I kept stumbling across stuff. Oh, that immigration reform, that was Diefenbaker's watch. Oh, that healthcare reform, that was Diefenbaker's watch. Oh, apartheid, Diefenbaker started the fight against apartheid. I didn't know these things. So I began to think, you know what, we need to do a reconsideration of John Diefenbaker. Newman was wrong. That in fact, yes, he had his personal demons. He certainly did. But he was actually a very successful prime minister. Major reforms took place on his watch. But I didn't want to diminish Pearson. I just wanted to say that Pearson was building on things that had already started, in many cases, under Diefenbaker. So I wanted to make it a joint biography in that sense. And then also, the other half of it was just such a great story. I mean, 10 years, these two men fought in the House of Commons and on the campaign trail for power over 4 elections. That's never happened before or since in the life of this country. So, the novelist didn't be said. It's just going to be a great story to tell. And it was a great deal of fun doing it.
Well, let's go back and look at some of the major elements of Diefenbaker's life. And I like this quote of yours from the book. At an early age, I developed a consciousness of injustice that has never left me. And then you add, and a sense of resentment and inferiority that never left him either. Why?
He was the son of a teacher, itinerant teacher, so they moved around from one community to another in southern Ontario. And then his father had a health crisis. It might well have been a mental health crisis, frankly. And the family decided to move to Saskatchewan, where they had a farm, not a very successful farm. So Diefenbaker grew up poor.
He's from Ontario.
He's from Ontario, but he was poor when he was in Ontario, and he was poor when he was in Saskatchewan. And he then became a very fine defense attorney, probably the finest defense attorney Saskatchewan has ever known. He also was a crusading attorney. So he would take on the cases that no one else would take on. He represented Indigenous defendants. He represented a woman who had been accused of murdering her baby, and another woman who had been accused of murdering her husband. So he sat in the jail cells listening to these people, and he grew up among these people. So it left him a genuine populist, someone who spoke for the little people and lived among them and was one of them himself. But it meant he never really belonged. He never belonged here. He was never comfortable with the elites of his own party.
And yet, you've got him in the book, and this story can't be true because it's too perfect to be true. You've got him at the age of 8 or 9 predicting he would be PM someday.
Well, he said it in his memoirs, and I believe it. Diefenbaker was always a man who felt he was possessed of destiny. But he was also neurotic and paranoid, increasingly paranoid, distrustful, indecisive. And he was quite often, as Prime Minister, his own worst enemy. And that's what so many people focus on, the eccentricities of Diefenbaker, the fallibilities of Diefenbaker. What they don't look at is the record of of those cabinets. And it is a very impressive record indeed.
We shall get to that, but I'm not finished with his childhood yet. Did he really meet Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier as a young kid?
Well, maybe. There's a statue, the Star Phoenix, I think, paid for a statue commemorating the event when he was a paperboy and he met Sir Wilfrid outside his train. And according to Diefenbaker, he finally, after having chatted with the Prime Minister, said, well, I can't stay any longer. I've got real work to do. And that's the story in the memoirs. That's the story that everybody tells. That's the story that may be true. But, as they say, some facts are too good to check.
Laurier had a generous immigration policy. He created the prairie provinces. He laid the foundations for the multiculturalism that Canada would soon embrace. So why was Dief a conservative and not a liberal?
Again, he was an outsider. In those days, Saskatchewan was deeply, deeply liberal. Diefenbaker used to joke that the only thing that protected conservatives in Saskatchewan were the game laws. So, of course, if everyone in Saskatchewan is liberal, he has to be a conservative. Also, he got into a fight with a prominent liberal lawyer and probably would never have prospered inside the party for that reason. But I think mostly just because he was a contrarian and a loner and wanted to be the big fish in a small party rather than a small fish in a big party.
The first 5 times he ran for office, municipally, provincially, federally, he lost them all. Why did he keep trying?
I think because he had that sense of destiny. Frankly, he should have lost the 6th. He should have lost the one where he actually finally did get in. But he had a sensational court case that involved a woman who had killed her husband, and her husband was a Nazi. And this was right at the outbreak of the Second World War. And so the sensational court case probably delivered him the vote in a way that it wouldn't have if he hadn't been trying the case.
Here's Bruce Hutchison, the former journalist, writing, he, Diefenbaker, was tall, lean, almost skeletal, his body motions jerky and spasmodic, his face pinched and white, his pallor emphasized by metallic black curls and sunken hypnotic eyes. How does a guy described like that turn into a guy who captivates the country?
Oh, because as Hutchison said in that same passage, once he started to speak, the room fell silent. Even as a university student at debating clubs, he had the ability to hold a room and to carry the room. He was probably the greatest orator of any prime minister we had in the life of this country. And even when he was in his 70s, he was out of power. He still could, go down a main street and people adored him. My own mother adored him. And he had that kind of a hold on people. But mostly, I think, it was just the power of his voice.
Okay, that's the early story on Dief. Let's go talk about Mike Pearson.
Sure.
Follow me. A different picture.
I had never noticed it before. All these years I've been in around the house. It's a smaller portrait just physically smaller. And he's smaller within the portrait than Diefenbaker is.
What does that say?
Yeah, I wish I'd known this before to put it in the book. It says a great deal about Pearson himself. I mean, he was a prime minister, and he was a man who wanted to be prime minister, so he had his ego. But he was also a modest man. His humor was self-deprecating. He was a team player. He played every sport there was, and rose through the ranks of the civil service and then in cabinet, because he was the kind of person that other people trusted and wanted to know and wanted to have as a friend. And I think the portrait speaks to that.
Another guy from Ontario.
So Pearson was the son of an itinerant preacher. Diefenbaker was the son of an itinerant teacher. And their early years, in that way, were quite similar, except that ministers lived better than teachers did. They had the manse. And moving around all the time could have made Pearson, like Diefenbaker, a bit of a loner, a bit isolated. Instead, he mastered the art of making friends instantly. And again, as I mentioned in the book, Diefenbaker's great passion was fishing, which is essentially a solitary pursuit, you and maybe a couple of friends, whereas Pearson could have been the head of athletics at the University of Toronto if he'd wanted to be. He was a great athlete, great baseball player, great hockey player, you name it, and he played it, and he played it well.
He played hockey at Oxford.
He did.
The Oxford Blues.
As you can imagine, there were a bunch of Canadians on the Oxford team, and they crucified all of the competition, not just in Britain, but in Europe.
Now, one thing I learned from your book that I did not know is that both these men fought in World War I, and they left the war, their military service, early because of some particular controversies. What's the story there?
Sure. So Pearson said that he was hit by a bus during a blackout. The bus was running without lights, and that was the end of his career as an aspiring pilot. But the record suggests, and the documents are available online now, that there was a medical history that had more to do with some kind of trauma. Almost looks like PTSD. Speculation that he crashed his plane and maybe couldn't get back into a plane after that. But whatever it was, he wasn't being hit by a bus. At least there's no medical records of him being hit by a bus or being hit by a bus in such a way that it would have invalided him home. He was sent home because of his nerves, and then invented this story, essentially. And the same is true of Diefenbaker. He said he was hit by an entrenching tool, like a shovel or a pickaxe, when he was training for digging trenches. But again, the medical record suggests that there was some kind of palpitations of the heart, which often is a subtext for, again, trauma. The medical board doesn't think he's fit to be an officer, cannot be safely sent to the front, and he was invalided at home. So both of those men made up stories as to why they didn't fight during the war. And I suspect most of them came to believe it at some level, because I found actually Diefenbaker's diary entries in his correspondence, which he should have destroyed if he wanted to keep that story secret.
No one called him Lester. Everyone called him Mike. How come?
Because when he was at flight training school, some officer said, "Lester's a sissy name. I'm going to call you Mike." And Mike agreed. And he was called Mike for the rest of his life, and called himself Mike for the rest of his life. And indeed, his biographer, John English, wrote a very fine volume, called him Mike all the way through it.
There would be a future Liberal leader in Canada, also with the first name Mike, who was named after him and didn't know it.
Yes, I didn't realize that. Michael Ignatieff was George Ignatieff's son. George Ignatieff was a good friend of Pearson's, and they were a small band of Canadians during the Battle of Britain, those heroic days, who lived and endured the Blitz together, became very close friends, in some cases even more than friends. And Ignatieff's son, Michael, is named, according to John English, after Mike Pearson, although I'm told that it's news to Michael Ignatieff.
Well, this is it. When I read it in your book, I emailed Mr. Ignatieff and I said, "Did you know this?" And he said, "Didn't know it at all, but I love Lester Pearson, so I'm happy to be named after him."
It's in the book.
Lester Pearson was a professor, do I have this right, who married one of his students?
Yes, he did. It was a bit unusual even then, but then a female student was fairly rare. But Marion was in one of his classes. He was just starting out. He was still in his 20s. As several people who took his classes said, he felt more like a student than a professor. But she was a very good student. He gave her an A, but she got A's everywhere. So I'm sure she deserved it as well.
Marion Pearson's best line is, "Behind every successful man, there stands a surprised woman." How much did she love, or not, being the wife of a very public man.
She didn't like it at all. And there were a lot of people who didn't like Marion Pearson very much at all. And she was criticized as being cold and harsh and bitter. But, you know, she herself was very intelligent and had all sorts of ambitions. When she married Lester Pearson, she knew she was sacrificing those ambitions to be the wife of a man who was rising in the public service and then in politics. She reconciled herself to that, but I don't think she was ever happy in that.
Her story really contrasts the story of Edna Diefenbaker's, John Diefenbaker's first wife. What was her ultimate destiny?
Edna, again, in some ways made John Diefenbaker. She was the one who taught him that you need to remember everybody's name and face and have a question for them when you see them on the street. She was his champion. She would have long conversations with Mackenzie King when he was prime minister. And Diefenbaker was on the opposition benches. She was also a good friend of Tommy Douglas when he was an MP and then later as premier. She was devoted to him. But John Diefenbaker was married to his wife, but always his mother's son, and his mother always came first. And Edna became increasingly frustrated with her role as a junior partner in what was essentially a three-way relationship. And she became increasingly resentful, eventually developed mental health issues and spent some time in the sanitarium, and was largely forgotten after John Diefenbaker married his second wife, Olive. Edna died of leukemia. But in many ways, Diefenbaker owes as much to Edna as he did to Olive.
All right, having set up the backgrounds of these two men, let's now talk about their duel. Shall we have a seat?
Let's.
So, 1957, Liberals have been in power for a while. Louis Saint-Laurent is the prime minister of the country. Everybody thinks he's going to sail to another victory. Who's this John Diefenbaker guy anyway, going up against him? What happens?
One of the great flukes in Canadian politics. So yeah, the Liberals had been in power since 1935. It seemed that they were just always going to be in power. They were the natural governing party. But there'd been a big fight over a pipeline the year before. And Canadians started to wake up to the fact that this government had been in power a very long time. And Saint-Laurent was looking quite old. And at the same time, just before the election happened, the Conservative leader of the day, George Drew, became deathly ill. And his doctor said, you have to step down or you're not going to survive. And so he did. And the party needed quickly to find a leader. And although Diefenbaker had no cachet within the ruling elites of the party, they needed somebody fast. The caucus liked Diefenbaker. The party faithful liked Diefenbaker. And Diefenbaker won a very quick and hastily arranged leadership. But that's all right, because we'll lose. We always lose. And once we lose, we can go looking for someone to replace Diefenbaker. But the whole world discovered, at least all of Canada discovered, that John Diefenbaker on the campaign trail is an astonishing politician. And he campaigned amazingly well. The polls still showed the Liberals well ahead. Maclean's went to bed with an issue assuming the Liberals had won the election. It was very much Dewey beats Truman. But on election night, to everyone's surprise except John Diefenbaker's, he always insisted he was going to win that election, and he was right, he did.
Okay, so Louis Saint-Laurent loses, the Liberals need a new leader, in comes Mike Pearson. His first speech, I gather, in the House of Commons is what?
A total disaster. The Liberals had been in power for so long, and they were so shocked that John Diefenbaker had defeated them, that they wanted to engineer the defeat of the government as quickly as possible so they could go back to being in power.
Because it was a minority government.
This was a minority government. What they hadn't noticed was that Diefenbaker was popular. He was governing well. He'd introduced major reforms. And the polls, were much earlier time. They weren't as powerful and important as they are now. But they showed that the Conservatives are doing well. Nonetheless, Lester Pearson wins the leadership of the Liberal Party. On his first appearance in the House of Commons as Liberal leader, he urges Diefenbaker to resign so that the Liberals can once again form government. And Diefenbaker sort of turns to the guy beside him and says, I got him. And he stands up and he just eviscerates Pearson, just eviscerates him. And everyone in the House knew it, including Pearson, who's admitted in his own memoirs that he was destroyed by Diefenbaker, who said, all right, you want an election? Let's have one. And they call the election, and it turns out to be the biggest majority in the history of the country.
208 seats.
208 seats, and I believe more than 50% of the vote.
How did Diefenbaker as Prime Minister then lead a huge majority government?
In many ways well, in some ways not well. Strangely, although we had a huge contingent of Quebecers, he didn't put very many Quebec ministers into cabinet, and he should have, because that eroded his support in Quebec. He made a deeply controversial decision early on, which was to cancel the Avro Arrow. The Arrow needed to be cancelled. It was obsolescent the day it was rolled out, and in fact, the Saint Laurent government had already decided to cancel the Arrow, but to wait until after the election to make the announcement. So he was only carrying out a decision made by the previous Liberal government. But still, it was hugely controversial. Still is to this day. There are still people who think he made a terrible mistake. He didn't. He developed a reputation quickly for dithering, for being combative, for not making decisions, and that's the narrative that gripped the parliamentary gallery. But what the gallery wasn't noticing was that he was also, his cabinet, were making huge reforms, eliminating the incredibly racist immigration policies of the country, bringing universal hospital care to the country, leading the fight against apartheid in the Commonwealth, bringing in the Canadian Bill of Rights, which has set the agenda, the rights agenda for the decades ahead. Big reforms in the Justice Department and penal reform. All in all, if you looked only at the agenda of the government and you forgot about all the storms and scandals, you would have said that was a very successful government.
Well, let's look at a few more things. First female cabinet minister ever, Ellen Fairclough from Hamilton. First Ukrainian cabinet minister ever, Michael Starr. First Indigenous senator ever, James Gladstone. First Nations got the vote for the first time in history. Diefenbaker himself is the first non-English, non-French background prime minister. How much of the fact that Canada is a multicultural country today do we owe to him?
A lot. Let's go back then to Ellen Fairclough and immigration. Up until that time, the most racist place in Canada was the Immigration Department. Its job was to keep Canada white, to keep only Europeans coming into the country and no one else. And Diefenbaker resented the fact that he had been made fun of because of his German name. So he put Ellen Fairclough into immigration and said, clean it up. And it took her a long time. But early in 1962, she stood up and announced a new order in council and said, henceforth, from this day on, the color of your skin, the country of your origin, the language that you speak, your religion shall have no bearing on your entry to Canada, only your suitability to integrate into this country. And that was the beginning, that day, that literal day, was the beginning of multiculturalism. And again, the book talks a lot about how Pearson complimented Diefenbaker, even though they clashed repeatedly. It was Pearson who came in and said, all right, but that's just a government order in council. How can we entrench that? And he came up with the point system, which gave us the multicultural country that we have today. So the two of them actually worked in tandem to transform Canada into a multicultural society.
There's a guy over my shoulder here, Pierre Trudeau, who was responsible for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But Diefenbaker had the Bill of Rights, which he brought in 1960. How significantly was that treated back in the day?
It was not treated significantly enough by the Supreme Court of the day. And Rosalie Abella talks about, I interviewed her for the book. And she points out that the Supreme Court of that time really just saw its job as deciding whether something was provincial jurisdiction or federal jurisdiction. It didn't really understand a rights agenda. So it downplayed the importance of the Bill of Rights. But Pierre Trudeau was always very grateful to John Diefenbaker for introducing that bill, because it introduced the notion of we need a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you might call it, entrenched in our Constitution. Was grateful to Diefenbaker for doing it. Had him over. They always liked each other. He had him over Sussex Drive for lunch. And whether or not you think the Supreme Court was right or wrong in downplaying the importance of the Bill of Rights, nonetheless, it started the conversation that led to our charter.
Who said of John Diefenbaker, I don't want to see that boring son of a bitch again?
Well, that would be John F. Kennedy.
Why did he say it?
Kennedy and Diefenbaker didn't get along. They were just old, young. And Diefenbaker was not someone that Camelot considered sufficiently interesting. But more important, Diefenbaker had initially agreed, when Eisenhower was president, to allow nuclear-tipped surface-to-air missiles into Canada, the Beaumark missiles. Diefenbaker later, though, became increasingly concerned about the fact that Canada would be a nuclear power. We would have nuclear weapons on our soil. There would be nuclear missiles on our fighters in Europe. His cabinet was split on the issue, and he refused to make a decision. He should have made the decision one way or another, but he refused to make a decision, and in not making a decision, he was in essence saying no. And Lester Pearson, who knew what side the bread was buttered on, the Liberal Party had always opposed nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. He did a Damascene conversion and suddenly announced that he would accept the nuclear tippable marks if he were Prime Minister. And in essence, the Kennedy administration campaigned for the Liberals during the 62 and 63 elections. Diefenbaker said, I'm not running against Mike Pearson, I'm running against John F. Kennedy. And largely, he was right.
And in 62, that massive majority government from 58 gets kicked down to a minority government.
Gets kicked down to a very weak minority government, doesn't last very long. The Beaumont missile crisis brings its downfall and brings Lester Pearson to power.
In 1963.
Correct.
Was Dief shocked that he was out after just not that many years, frankly, in power? He'd waited a long time to get there.
He was deeply disappointed and, of course, sought to return to power. But in some ways, I think he was happier in opposition. John Diefenbaker was a defense attorney, a crusading defense attorney. And John Diefenbaker, with the left on his hip and the right hand, how dare you, was in some ways more comfortable as leader of the opposition and had more fun as leader of the opposition, I think, than he had as prime minister.
If he was such a disaster in government, which is, a lot of the conventional wisdom of the day, how come the Liberals come in 63 under Mike Pearson with just a minority? And
in 65 with just a minority. Pearson wasn't a very good politician. He came up through the ranks of the diplomatic corps, became, in those days, believe it or not, you could do this sort of thing. He went from deputy minister to minister in his own department, and then became leader. And he was very comfortable in the corridors of power. He would have been very happy in a place like this, but he was not happy on the campaign trail. He spoke with a bit of a lisp. He was not a natural politician, and Diefenbaker was born to campaign. So time and again, the Liberals went into the election campaign fairly confident they were going to win a majority government, and came out again with another minority because Dief out-campaigned Mike.
But Dief is still the leader. He's 68 years old and he won't step down. Why not?
No, and this is where it starts to get sad. Whatever his ego, his vanity, his paranoia, he simply could not accept the fact that he had lost now the 63 election. He had lost the 65 election. It was time for him to go. It was time for a new generation of leadership, but he wouldn't leave. And Dalton Camp and others had to conspire within the party to force a leadership convention in which he ran, which was, again, sad.
He ran to succeed himself.
He ran to succeed himself. Did very badly, of course, but stayed in the House, and literally died while he was still in office.
So Mike Pearson becomes. Well, let's look at some of the record of the Pearson years, which are admittedly short, right? 63 to 68, he's prime minister. Got a lot done.
He did. So he built on Diefenbaker's healthcare reforms in which hospital care became universal and made it universal public hospital care. A commission, by the way, that Diefenbaker had appointed, but it was Pearson who actually initiated it. It was Pearson who created the point system to entrench the immigration reforms. It was Pearson who created the Canada Pension Plan. It was government that created the Canada Pension Plan. And it was Pearson who gave us the Canadian flag, something that Diefenbaker stoutly opposed. He wept when the new flag was raised because he was still wedded to the British Empire. But Pearson knew where the world was going, and he knew that the empire was dying and that the American empire was what Canada had to deal with now. And that flag is one of his greatest accomplishments.
Why would Pearson step down after only 5 years as prime minister?
He was old. He was tired. His government had been racked with scandal. We've forgotten about them now, but by God, they did scandals in those days. We've lost the art of scandal, I'm afraid. And he was not very popular. And Expo 67, sort of showed the world a young and vibrant and vital Canada. It was the 60s. It was demonstrations, occupations, the keys to the war in Vietnam. And there was a feeling in Canada that the two old, tired men who'd been fighting each other for a decade needed to go away and introduce a new generation of leadership. And of course, Pearson completely agreed, happily stepped down, and worked to ensure that Pierre Trudeau would be his successor.
Trudeau takes over, 1968. 4 years later, Pearson is dead. Where is he buried?
A beautiful cemetery in Wakefield, Quebec, just across the river from Ottawa. If you're ever in the national capital, especially if it's a nice day, go up to the Wakefield Cemetery. You'll see his place of rest there, and also you'll just get a great view of the Gatineau Hills.
Dief continues, as you suggest, to be an MP until age 83. He's suffering from dementia at this point. Where's his final resting place?
Diefenbaker is buried back at the University of Saskatchewan. He was chancellor there. He wanted to be buried there. His archives are there. And if you're in Saskatoon and you want to visit one of the most beautiful college campuses in the country at the University of Saskatchewan, you'll find the Diefenbaker Center there and his place of rest.
I'm guessing that you are actually too young to have remembered much of the Diefenbaker and Pearson years, because you're not much older than I am, and I don't remember those years at all either. So where does your interest in this time period in our history come from?
Actually, it's the only time I ever mentioned myself in a book. My first political memory was of going into my grandma's house. Mum and grandma were both there, and they were so upset. And it was the 1968 the 1967 Conservative Leadership Convention.
Maple Leaf Gardens.
And where Diefenbaker was being defeated. And they said, this is terrible. He's a wonderful man. He speaks like Churchill. And these awful people are forcing him to leave the party. So that's where I first started to become interested in politics. And I then watched Pierre Trudeau win the next year. There was a wonderful series, The 10th Decade, that I used extensively in the book, which chronicles this decade of power between the two men, 1970, I believe it was. And then, the die was cast.
Did you ever meet either one of them?
No, never met either. I didn't get up onto Parliament Hill until 2002.
I've got 1,000 questions about what you might have asked each of them had you had the opportunity, but I can imagine that one of your favorite imaginary dinner parties would be John Ibbitson, John Diefenbaker, Lester Pearson, all together at the same table.
Oh, I don't know about that. Because they'd have just fought the whole time. You wouldn't be able to get a good... I mean, I guess as a journalist, it would be fun to watch.
Yeah.
Because they became... They didn't just compete politically. They came to dislike each other strongly. Pearson despised Diefenbaker, and Marion despised Diefenbaker as well. So it would be an interesting dinner party, but one in which I don't think I'd be doing much more than trying to keep anyone from smashing their glasses.
That'd be fun.
Well, it would be that. It would be that.
John, it's a great book. Congratulations.
Thank you, Steve.
Well done. Yeah.
Here's a look at something we're working on.
I think we're kind of in the age of alchemy. You take these models, you stir them up, you hope that it works, you get a little more data. But we as a field don't really yet know what we're doing. And right now the alchemy is reaching its limits, I think.
That's coming up on the agenda.